Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Diemez.
And I'm Brian Rohenbacher.
And we are ready to get this show started. Lots of really deep and kind of, heart-rending topics that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, definitely. In RTB 101, we'll be hearing from molecular biologist AJ Roberts on why would God allow pain and suffering?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I think one that both skeptics and Christians grapple with. So looking forward to that. In Give and Take, Jeff Swearink will be talking with astrophysicist Hugh Ross about the Earth, Sun, and our eyes being designed to prevent myopia.
First up is Culture Talk. Sandra's going to be chatting with biochemist Fazale Rana on biochemical finite-state machines. Not 100% sure what that is, so I'm definitely going to be paying attention.
You said it well, though. Good job.
Thank you. Let's check it out.
Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. And I'm joined today with biochemist Fazale Rana. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Sandra.
We're going to be talking about something that was confusing Brian. He's like, what is this finite-state machine? So you wrote an article about finite-state machines. What is it?
Yeah, well, it is a confusing term that probably most people aren't familiar with, but you actually encounter finite-state machines all the time in your day-to-day lives. So, for example, vending machines are an example of a finite-state machine. And it's actually a mathematical concept, an abstract mathematical entity that essentially mathematicians use for computational purposes. But a finite-state machine is a machine that exists in a number of possible states, and it receives inputs that will cause the machine to transition from one state to the other in a predetermined manner. So a real-life example of a finite-state machine would be a vending machine, right?
So I punch in D6 and I get the sour cream and chives chips?
That's right. That's right.
Awesome.
So what's happening is, like with a vending machine, it's fully stocked, it's the initial state. And so the two inputs it's looking for, and it has to be in the right sequence, would be putting in the right amount of money, and then you make a selection. And then it goes from its initial state to a new state where it delivers that bag of chips for you. But if you made another selection, let's say a chocolate bar, that would cause a different transition to a different state. So, vending machines are an example of this mathematical abstract entity. But vending machines are really pretty sophisticated because they're performing a computation based on inputs and, again, going to a predetermined state as a result of that input.
So what exactly was discovered, like biochemical finite-state machines? What is that?
Yeah, well, our team of researchers from UC San Francisco discovered that there are biochemical finite-state machines in single-celled organisms. And these machines actually very well may explain the sophisticated behavior shown by cells. So they were looking at a particular cell called euploides, which is a single-celled organism that typically swims around in free form in water, but can attach to solid surfaces and with appendages start walking around. But the gait is very sophisticated. It almost looks like the cell is making decisions and then responding to things in the environment. And so they were curious as to how it was going about doing it, and they discovered that what's controlling the behavior of the appendages is a network of microtubules, that can exist in different states based on the input from the environment. And so it literally is a biochemical finite-state machine where the organism is engaged in computations with this biochemical machinery to essentially go from one state to the other, and that, again, is affecting its behavior. So it's a pretty remarkable discovery, to think that, here inside the cell is a real-life example of the types of machinery that we interact with all the time. In this case, vending machines or turnstiles or things like that.
So you said, I think it's a single cell. So that's interesting because that would be pretty simple then, but even something that simple is showing a machine. Like I think that you've written about that before and how there's complexity even in something that is considered simple. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I mean, when you start thinking about, again, the sophistication of single-celled organisms at the molecular level, it's astounding. But what's also remarkable is that complexity bears an eerie similarity to the types of designs that we would produce as human beings. And this allows us to make a revitalized watchmaker argument for God's existence and role in the origin and the design of life. And this is based on the work of William Paley, who said, hey, a watch is obviously the work of a mind. And when we look at biological systems, we see machines that have the same attributes as watches. So if a watch requires a mind, so too must these machines. And so we know that a vending machine is the product of, minds that have designed it and constructed it to work a certain way. And so when we see the same kind of machines in cells, isn't that evidence for the work of a creator?
Right. No, I think that's really interesting. So how then would you have a conversation with someone if they know you're a scientist, they know you're a Christian, they might be like, how do you connect the two? And how would you have that conversation and point to not just a designer or a maker, watchmaker, but specifically the God of the Bible or the watchmaker of the Bible? How do you make that distinction?
Well, I think it would be fun if you find yourself at a vending machine in your office, with another coworker, and as you're putting in money and getting snacks or drinks out of that machine, to strike up a conversation. Just, hey, have you ever thought about what's going on in a vending machine? And hey, this is an example of a finite state machine. And then that leads you to maybe pointing out that these types of machines seem to also exist in biochemical systems. But to me, the connection to the God of the Bible is really based on the image of God. If we, as human beings, are made in God's image, then what we do as many creators should be a reflection of our creator. And so it's not just simply a creator, an unidentified creator, but a creator whose mind resonates with our mind. And the Christian faith explains that through the image of God concept.
Well, thank you so much for that. I would say if you're going to talk to someone at a vending machine, let them eat their snack in case they're hangry. You don't want to start, talking to them about faith and stuff quite yet. Let them eat. So if you'd like to hear more from Fazale Rana, go to reasons.org and check out his blog, The Cell's Design.
Your talk is it's not technical, but what would you say to a person who comes to you, a friend, who is actually in the grieving process of having some real horrible thing happen to them?
It happened just earlier this week. One of my very good friends who doesn't live near me sent me a text that her mother is diagnosed with a very severe form of aggressive stomach cancer. And so immediately, number one, she's my friend, and so my heart goes out to her immediately. I've heard her talk frequently about her mother. I know that both my friend and her mother and her father are all believers, and so I don't worry about their ultimate destiny. I feel secure in their ultimate destiny. But my immediate response is, I don't want this to sound like it's a cookbook answer. It's a real answer. It's the N.T. Wright response. I bring the love of Christ to bear, not just in the words that I share, but in supporting her in every way I can and in praying. And as a Christian, I believe that God brings real solace, sometimes healing, but always real solace to those of us who turn to him in prayer. And I know that my friend, I don't want to say her name, but I know my friend, I've shared with many other friends who know her. I know that she's been deeply encouraged by the response of her friends who are aware of her suffering and her mother's suffering. Whether we're a Christian or not, we face things like cancer, and we face suffering, and we face ultimately death. And I guess what I'm trying to share and help us see is that as Christians, we can bring hope into the middle of those types of adversities that we encounter. Hope that is not easy to find, and I would even suggest that it's probably downright impossible to find apart from the promise of God or the love of our brothers and sisters in Christ. Now, of course, if I'm not a Christian, I still have the love and support of my family, and thank God for that. And as Christians, I would say that, you know, it's our call to bring even love and compassion, regardless of a person's religious perspective or disposition. And that just really ought to be the hallmark. Every time we see suffering, that needs to be, our heart needs to be God's heart. And God's heart is to bear with us in our suffering and to encourage us that it's temporary and that ultimately there will be a greater glory.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah.
You paid me a great compliment, AJ, by asking me to be able to chime in on some
Absolutely.
of these.
Would you like to chime in on this one, Ross?
I would.
Okay.
I would. I think,
yeah, I did. I don't like just hearing myself talk. So,
Well,
so I asked
like
Ross if he
hearing you
would weigh
talk.
in. So,
I read a headline to an article once, and I just thought just the headline had so much in it, and it was, you can ask why God doesn't do more, but the real question is, why don't we do more?
yeah.
We're looking for God to take care of situations that He has given to us to deal with.
That's absolutely right.
And we punt, we hand it off, we try to give it back to Him. And you and I have a common friend right now who's in Las Vegas taking care of
His mother who's not doing well.
his mother
Yeah.
who's not doing well. And
Yeah.
you know, how do you and I, as friends of Him, what are we supposed to do at this time? And I think,
Yeah.
you know, this whole question of evil and suffering, if you turn it around and think, imagine no pain and suffering in the world, none at all, zero.
I actually think we wouldn't have these virtues that we value so much. There would be no courage. There would be no need for courage. There would be no compassion. We'd all just be fine and dandy, and
Right.
we wouldn't need these things, right? And so
we'd
I
have
just
the
think it's a bizarre thought when you really start to think it through.
Right, we'd have the shallowest relationships because we wouldn't need each other. There'd be nothing gained from the relationships that we have. And so it seems obvious that something is necessary to bind us together in community.
Yeah.
And it sure seems excessive sometimes, but there's nothing else that can suffice but some pain and suffering to keep us bonded together.
Yeah, and I think it's also an instrument for getting our attention and maybe asking those deeper questions that sometimes we just don't take time to ask. But when we're faced with tragedy or adversity or pain or suffering, it's kind of like this thing we can't sidestep.
Yeah.
It sort of forces the issues for us, if you will.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink here. Welcome to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas to help you be more convinced of the truth of Christianity. Today, I'm joined by President and founder of Reasons to Believe, Dr. Hugh Ross, and we're going to investigate some design evidence focused around myopia. Hugh, good to have you here today.
Well, thank you.
Well, it sounds kind of weird to talk about design around an infirmity, if you will. So before we get into that, why don't you kind of give us just what is myopia and why is it something we should be concerned about?
Well, it's nearsightedness.
Okay.
And we now know it's a direct result of the eyeball getting a little longer, therefore it doesn't focus quite the way it should for distant objects.
So, I mean, how big of a deal is this? Is this just a few people have it? A lot of people have it? What?
It used to be no big deal 100 years ago. It's now a big deal. And it's a big deal because people are inside more. They're not out, they're not exposed. So particularly cities where people are basically in vehicles or inside or in their offices, that's where you see a problem. South Korea is probably the most dramatic example of myopia, where you got more than 90% of the population suffering from it.
90%?
Well, in some cases, it's way over 90%.
That is a lot of, that's a very large percentage of the population that's dealing with that. So,
well, one reason why it's so high is it's so easy to treat. I mean, all you need to do is get a special pair of glasses and you're fine.
Okay, so you can put on a pair of glasses and not have to worry too much about that. So,
but I think that explains why the percentage has gone way up because, hey, if you get it, no big deal, just get some glasses. And so basically it's encouraged people, hey, I don't have to get outside. I can just stay inside all the time. And hey, if I get myopia, just buy a pair of glasses.
All right, so we'll come back to that in a couple of minutes, but kind of give us a little bit of background. What is it that causes myopia? You said it's the eyeball gets elongated, but kind of dig into that. Give us a little more scientific details. What's going on there?
the lack of ultraviolet radiation exposure, and that explains why it's an inside phenomena. I mean, if you're spending all your time in your home or on a train or in the office, you're not getting exposed to ultraviolet radiation.
So is that something that even, I mean, do you have to be in a dark room, or do the windows even filter out the ultraviolet?
Windows filter out ultraviolet, some more so than others, but every window filters out the ultraviolet that's crucial to prevent this from happening. The other thing that's interesting, it seems to be morning exposure is more important than evening exposure. And so getting up early, getting outside, getting that early ultraviolet exposure from the sun, that seems to be what makes the difference.
So what is it about the exposure to the ultraviolet radiation that makes a difference? What's going on in the eye, if you can give us some more details?
Well,
there.
what happens is it causes the eye to sustain its shape. And so the lack of ultraviolet exposure basically encourages the eyeball to slowly elongate. And that's something they've seen with children in South Korea. The older the population, the higher the percentage of people that have myopia. So it basically is saying this is something that takes time to develop. And so the lack of ultraviolet exposure over the course of 20 years drives the percentage up from a few percent up to 90% plus.
So this really is saying that being outside is a good thing. Well, so I guess another question I have in there, it's like I know our atmosphere filters out a lot of ultraviolet light. So how can being outside help? I mean, ultraviolet light's kind of damaging to the human body as well.
It is, but the wonderful thing about our atmosphere, it blocks out the short wavelength ultraviolet radiation, which is bad for you, and allows in the long wavelength radiation, which is important for generating vitamin D as the sunlight exposes your skin. So we need to be exposed to the long wavelength, but not the short wavelength, and Earth's atmosphere beautifully does that.
So, I find that fascinating, in part because a lot of my research, especially when you're dealing with gamma rays, you're looking for Cherenkov radiation, which tends to be peaked out in the ultraviolet. And that was always a problem, is that the atmosphere filtered a lot of that.
It does, yeah.
Which is a good thing. Like I said, it prevents, because the ultraviolet radiation causes
You wouldn't be able to
sunburn.
do your research if it didn't filter it out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a little bit annoying, but, ultraviolet radiation also tends to lead to sunburn and other sorts of things. So it's, how would you see design in this? So kind of articulate, why do you see design in this?
Well, I see design in this in that having our atmosphere designed in such a way that it lets through just the right amount of long wavelength ultraviolet radiation, stabilizes the shape of the eye over decades. And God designed us to be able to live 80 or 90 years. So it's important that our eyeballs are not changed too much over that period. If you're talking an insect, no big deal. Or if you're talking an animal that lives only a few years, no big deal. But that's what the South Korean data is showing us. Over the course of 20 years, if you're not being exposed to that radiation, then the eyeball goes unstable.
So, we've got a lot of planets that we're finding outside of our solar system. How would this sort of affect where it seems like the Earth's atmosphere, the production of the sun, seem to be set up so that we get the right amount of the good radiation and not the bad? How would that play out on different planets?
Well, you see in the astronomical literature a lot of talk about the ultraviolet habitable zone. And that's a recognition that your planet needs to be orbiting a star where the planet has just the right atmosphere, where it lets in the ultraviolet radiation that's essential for life. If no ultraviolet radiation makes it to the surface, life is impossible. There's a lot of molecular processes that go on in every life form that critically depend on ultraviolet radiations, particularly the advanced plants. So you need ultraviolet radiation. But too much is a problem, too little is a problem. And if you have this stuff at the wrong wavelength, that's a problem. So you have to fine tune the comes through. And it turns out the ultraviolet habitable zone is way narrower than the liquid water habitable zone. And for a planet to be truly habitable, you want to be in both. And for very few star planet systems, do the two actually overlap?
Well, if you've got to have the right source, that has implications for what kind of star you're orbiting.
Yeah, you need the right star.
And if you're worried about what gets filtered through the atmosphere, that requires the right size planet with the right size atmosphere. Presumably.
Correct. And the right distance from the star.
Presumably Mars would have less ultraviolet because it's further away, but more because it's got such a minimal atmosphere, whereas Venus would have more, but its atmosphere would filter virtually all of it out. So those are the sorts of complications you're dealing with there. So, how would you use this, if you could here in like 30 seconds, how would you use this topic to bring up a conversation about pointing to the gospel?
Well, just making the whole point. I mean, we live on a planet, we're orbiting a star that must be phenomenally fine-tuned to make our existence possible, especially if you're talking human beings. And doesn't that testify of a personal being that personally crafted the solar system, the universe for that matter, for a particular benefit? And if that's the case, if it's a personal being, wouldn't it be a good idea to find out who he is and whether or not he wants a relationship with us?
Well, thank you very much, Hugh. I appreciate your comments. When we look at the place where we live, and the ability to even look at things with our eyes requires good eyesight. And what we find is that the Earth, the sun, and even the human eyes have to be, it's like they're designed to have good eyesight and to prevent myopia. I'd encourage you to go to reasons.org, check out Hugh's latest blog on this. It's Eyes, Sun, and Earth Designed to Prevent Myopia. It gives you a lot of details of what myopia is, how big a problem it is, and also some of the things that we can do to prevent it, as well as how to use this intricate system that allows us to see, to point others to the creator of the universe and how they can know him.
That does it for us this week on 2819. We hope you enjoyed this episode and that it helped equip you to share your faith with confidence and compassion.
And we hope that you all know now what finite state machines are. Maybe? Yes. And don't forget, subscribe to the show and also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show. We'd love to hear what you think finite state machines are.
I'll be reading all those comments.
Yes.
If you want the podcast version of 2019, we are on most major podcast services. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast.
See you next week.
Bye.